The archives of human discovery are littered with honest miscalculations, but rarely do we find a fabrication so perfectly engineered that it paralyzes an entire scientific discipline for 4 decades. In the twilight of the Edwardian era, the British scientific establishment suffered from a profound and quiet desperation. They possessed the world's most formidable empire, commanding vast resources and unparalleled academic institutions, yet they lacked the one treasure that conferred true evolutionary prestige. They desperately needed a native hominid ancestor. This glaring absence gnawed relentlessly at the collective ego of London's intellectual elite. Germany proudly boasted the robust Neanderthal, and France displayed the elegant Cro-Magnon, securing their places in the grand narrative of human origins. Britain, meanwhile, had nothing but scattered flint tools and an overwhelming inferiority complex. They were primed, psychologically and academically, to embrace any narrative that placed the cradle of supreme human intellect firmly on English soil. Into this atmosphere of intense nationalistic yearning stepped Charles Dawson. He was a solicitor by trade, but an antiquarian by passion, a man who possessed a remarkable, almost suspicious, knack for unearthing exactly what the experts desired to see. He had already built a modest reputation delivering unusual fossils to London's museums, earning him the moniker of the Wizard of Sussex. He was an outsider looking in, hungry for the validation of the academic aristocracy, and armed with a dangerous understanding of their deepest intellectual insecurities. The bait was formally cast in the spring of 1912. Workers at a gravel pit in the sleepy Sussex village of Piltdown supposedly handed the amateur archaeologist a fragment of a thick, seemingly ancient human skull. It was a quiet, muddy inception for what would become the most audacious deception in the history of paleoanthropology. The ambitious amateur immediately brought his prize to the pinnacle of the establishment, presenting the fragments to Arthur Smith Woodward, the esteemed keeper of geology at the British Museum. The mere association with such a towering figure of authority instantly insulated the discovery from casual scrutiny. The expert's eager endorsement gave the muddy bone fragments an immediate, unassailable gravity. The physical evidence was a masterstroke of anatomical tailoring. Over the following months, the gravel pit yielded a dark, ape-like jawbone containing 2 molars worn flat in a distinctly human manner. It was the literal embodiment of the era's dominant, yet entirely theoretical, evolutionary model, presenting a creature with the swollen brain case of a modern man and the primitive face of an ape. The genius of the crime lay not in the bones themselves, but in the perpetrator's flawless understanding of his audience. The artifacts were designed to confirm existing biases, acting as a mirror that reflected the exact hypotheses published by the very men who would be tasked with authenticating the find. The forgery was a bespoke suit, tailored to fit the exact dimensions of British scientific prejudice. The physical fabrication required a meticulous, albeit crude, artistry. The conspirator took a relatively recent human cranium, chosen for its unusual thickness, and paired it with the severed mandible of a modern orangutan. To simulate the deep antiquity of the Pleistocene epoch, the bones were boiled in a chemical bath of iron sulfate and chromic acid. This caustic process imparted a rich, convincing mahogany patina that perfectly mimicked millennia of natural fossilization in iron-rich gravel. In December 1912, the trap snapped shut before a packed, breathless audience at the Geological Society of London. The reconstructed skull was officially christened Eoanthropus dawsoni, translating to Dawson's Dawn Man. The room erupted in applause, blinded by the intoxicating rush of national pride, as the highest echelons of science officially welcomed their fabricated forebear. The announcement sent immediate shockwaves through the global scientific community, fundamentally rewriting the accepted timeline of human evolution overnight. Textbooks were rapidly revised to feature the Sussex discovery, museum exhibits were hastily constructed to display plaster casts, and the obscure gravel pit became a site of almost religious pilgrimage for naturalists around the world. Yet, beneath the triumphant headlines, a quiet current of dissent rippled through the international community. Skeptics, primarily highly trained anatomists in America and Germany, pointed out the jarring, almost impossible mismatch between the highly evolved brain case and the primitive jaw. They argued it was far more likely that two entirely separate creatures, a modern human and an ape, had simply died in the same location and been mixed together by the shifting earth over time. The articulation of the jaw joint was missing entirely, a convenient absence that prevented anyone from proving the two pieces did not actually fit together. Whenever this skepticism threatened to gain traction, the earth miraculously provided a counter-argument. The perpetrator returned to the site, seeding it with a carved elephant bone implement that resembled a crude cricket bat, and eventually the remains of a second identical specimen miles away. The lie reinforced itself with calculated precision, burying doubt under a steady stream of manufactured evidence. Confirmation bias operates as a powerful cognitive anesthetic, numbing the critical faculties of even the most brilliant minds. The British experts dismissed the foreign critics, rationalizing away the physical impossibilities because the alternative was simply too horrifying. To admit they had been comprehensively duped by a forgery was a humiliation the empire's scientific vanguard could not entertain. Decades marched on, carrying the world through the unimaginable devastation of two global conflicts. The original discoverer took his secrets to the grave in 1916, leaving his Dawn Man safely enshrined behind the glass cases of the British Museum. The shadow of that gravel pit still stretched long across the scientific landscape, dictating the parameters of evolutionary research. But the Earth is a stubborn keeper of records, and it eventually began to yield genuine truths that contradicted the fabricated past, as authentic hominid fossils began emerging from the limestone caves of South Africa and the riverbanks of Java. The Sussex skull became an increasingly awkward evolutionary anomaly. The new discoveries featured small brains and human-like jaws, presenting the exact opposite anatomical progression of the British specimen. By the mid-20th century, the grand narrative could no longer sustain its own glaring contradictions. A new generation of researchers, unburdened by the blinding nationalistic fervor of their predecessors, inherited the venerated relics. They approached the sacred bones not with patriotic reverence, but with a cold, unforgiving, investigative eye. The definitive turning point arrived with the application of a novel geochemical technique known as fluorine dating. Bones absorb fluorine from surrounding groundwater at a relatively steady, predictable rate. By measuring the chemical concentration within a fossil, scientists can determine its relative age compared to other bones found in the exact same soil profile. Kenneth Oakley, an anthropologist at the Natural History Museum, applied this rigorous chemical test to the legendary fragments, boring tiny holes to extract the precious bone dust. The results were immediate, undeniable, and devastating to the established dogma. The skull and the jaw contained trace, almost non-existent amounts of fluorine. They were not million-year-old relics of the Pleistocene epoch, and they definitively did not belong alongside the genuinely ancient, extinct animal bones that had been conveniently found near them in the pit. The majestic timeline of the great British ancestor instantly collapsed into dust. The skull was revealed to be a mere 50,000 years old, a relatively modern human. The jaw was shockingly recent, eventually identified as belonging to an orangutan that had likely died only decades before its supposed discovery in the Sussex mud. With the chemical illusion permanently shattered, the physical evidence was subjected to rigorous, unforgiving microscopic examination by a team of skeptical researchers. The brutal, unmistakable scratches of a metal file were discovered crisscrossing the molars. This revealed exactly how the prominent ape teeth had been artificially flattened to mimic the distinctive side-to-side wear patterns produced by human chewing. The deeper the investigators looked, the more the meticulous artistry unraveled before their eyes. The dark, ancient coloration was definitively proven to be a superficial stain, not the result of millennia buried in the earth. In a final, almost comical insult to the establishment, a simple pinprick revealed that the core of the supposedly ancient bone was still bright white. In November 1953, the scientific establishment was forced to execute a deeply humiliating public retreat. The British Museum formally announced to the world that the famous missing link was a chimera, a deliberate and elaborate scientific fraud. The grand narrative of human origins had been successfully hijacked by a painted ape jaw and a handful of filed teeth. The revelation sent a chilling tremor through the academic world, fundamentally shaking the foundations of institutional trust. It was a terrifying demonstration of how easily the rigorous mechanisms of the scientific method could be subverted when a deception perfectly aligns with the unspoken desires and prejudices of the observers. The hoax forced a brutal systemic reckoning within the discipline of paleoanthropology. It destroyed the lingering romanticism of the gentleman amateur and mandated a new era of strict, multidisciplinary verification. The discipline had to learn, at an excruciating cost to its reputation, that empirical evidence must always dictate theory, never the reverse. The reputations of the brilliant men who championed the discovery were permanently, irreparably scarred by their own gullibility. The esteemed keeper of geology had spent the last decades of his life blindly defending a chimera, writing countless papers on a fiction, his legacy forever tethered to the greatest humiliation in British science. The identity of the lone mastermind, or the exact network of conspirators who orchestrated the deception, remains a subject of intense historical debate. Suspects range from disgruntled museum volunteers seeking revenge to famous authors playing an elaborate joke, yet the ambitious solicitor from Sussex remains the absolute center of gravity for the crime. Whoever wielded the file and the acid possessed a terrifying, almost predatory understanding of human vulnerability. They knew that a lie, if expertly tailored to flatter the ego and confirm the deeply held beliefs of its target, will not just be accepted, it will be fiercely defended by the victims themselves. The legacy of the fabricated Dawn Man is not merely a footnote of embarrassment in the annals of history. It stands as a permanent, necessary monument to the absolute necessity of relentless skepticism in the pursuit of truth, a warning carved in stained bone. Today, the fragments sit locked in the archives, no longer evidence of human evolution, but priceless artifacts of human deception. The echoes of its false promise followed every subsequent fossil discovery, permanently altering the threshold for what constitutes scientific proof. This story investigates the fragile, easily manipulated boundary between empirical truth and compelling fiction. It proves, with devastating clarity, that the most dangerous lies are not those that challenge our understanding of the world, but those that tell us exactly what we desperately want to hear.